I'm super excited today to get to bring my friend, someone that I know actually through my children's school. Danielle Mitchell is joining us today. She is a nutritionist, she's a dietitian, she is a wealth of information when it comes to overall health. I want to read you her bio because Danielle, wow, it's impressive. Okay, here we go. So, Danielle is a licensed professional counselor, registered dietitian nutritionist, functional medicine certified health coach. Wow. Danielle graduated from A&M with a bachelor's degree in nutritional science, completed her dietetic internship from the University of Houston for a dietetic licensure. She then went on to complete a master's of education in counseling at the University of Houston, where you obtained a second license as a licensed professional counselor. Danielle, I know you are full of information, so I can't wait to talk to you.
Thank you. Such an honor. I always tell my kids, I should have gone to med school. That was enough school. I should have gone to med school.
You went through a lot of school, lots of academics, no question. I want to start off by talking about fasting because it's something that really is all the buzz these days. You hear a lot of people in the nutritional world talking about that. What's your take on fasting?
Great question. The first thing that comes up when I'm thinking about fasting is I like to reframe it. The word fasting can conjure up just a myriad of different pros and cons, for and against, from the medical community. And so generally, if I bring up the term resting and digesting, very few people have issue with that, right? We know this idea of cellular resting and digesting seems to be, from all stages of life, seems to be valuable for giving someone's digestive system, for giving their cardiovascular system, for giving their mental health, right? We all know the value of rest. So when we think about a cellular resting and digesting, and the term, kind of the clinical term that we use in the science world, is thinking about autophagy or autophagy, depending on who you're talking to. And so we know that cells, at a cellular level, these cells have to have support with their autophagy. We know that cellular degradation and recycling is kind of what autophagy is, right? Our cells have to turn over, they have to replace themselves. And when they do, they're functioning efficiently. When they don't, we see chronic illness, we see blood sugar dysregulation, we see developmental disorders in kiddos. We see all these potentials when our cells are not turning over and replacing themselves. And so I say all that because when we then introduce this idea of fasting or resting and digesting, it makes a lot more sense to people to say, okay, so if I allow my cells an opportunity to rest and digest, they're going to function more efficiently. And at that basic level, right, then we can start a much bigger conversation of, well, what layers or levels of fasting are we indicating, right? So typically, we say at baseline, a fast would be considered 12 hours. Now, if you think about babies, right? Babies, once they're sleeping well for their moms and dads, those babies should be getting somewhere between 11, 12 hours of sleep. And so babies in this like critical growth and developmental stage in their life, they're doing what we hope and think all of our bodies could do long term. Raise your hand if you would love to sleep 12 hours a day, right? That would be delightful. And so when that's not possible for us to sleep and get that cellular degradation and recycling happening at its optimal level, then what we attempt to do is say, hey, what are other ways that we might can mimic that resting and digesting? And so fasting, intermittent fasting as it's commonly called now, intermittent fasting has made its way into clinical literature, really even into medical nutrition therapy, for benefits with type 1 diabetes, type 2 diabetes, blood sugar regulation, and hoping that we can, at a cellular level, promote resting and digesting for the benefit of those cells. Now that we're kind of seeing intermittent fasting enter into the more health and wellness, right? Weight loss, weight management, anti-aging, there's still a lot of good science to back that up as far as the 12-hour fast at minimum, where there's a little discrepancy, I should say a lot of discrepancy in the medical literature, is how much of a fast is considered helpful versus harmful, and to which groupings of people might a fast be most beneficial. So without getting into too much of the science and boring people, the thing that I like to consider with the clients that come into our office is, it's generally reasonable and wise to say somewhere between 12 to 15 hours of resting and digesting is good for every person's body. So practically speaking, if I aim to eat dinner with my family, as hard as it may be, right? If we aim to eat at 6 o'clock
Mhm.
and finish our dinner and kitchen's closed, we have our treat, we have a dessert, whatever that might be, and then we don't eat anything until 6 a.m. the next morning, that's technically a fast. Now, it's not the intermittent fasting that a lot of people are suggesting could have more impact on our health,
Mhm.
but even at just a cellular level, that 12-hour fast can be valuable. And then we can get into the minutia, for people who want to, about, well, what extended times of fasting
Mhm.
might be more valuable for certain health aspects. Is there some value in doing, a solid day of fasting or a liquid only fasting? So those details, for me, I really take those into account for each client on an individual basis, because their nutrigenomics may indicate that that could be helpful or not helpful, particularly with females in the perimenopause, menopause world, right? There may be times where extended fasting is actually more harmful to the body as far as raising cortisol
Mhm.
levels. And so that's something that I want to work as a team with someone's medical team, their gynecologist, to say, hey, how do we individualize this for that patient? And then, of course, the third category that I'm always very cautious to take a very individualized approach is anyone with a history of disordered eating.
Mhm.
We want to be really careful that resting and digesting is for the good of the body, not the restriction of
Mhm.
the food. And so I tend to have a very favorable perspective on resting and digesting for cellular health, and then want to have a more in-depth conversation person to person about the layers and levels of intermittent fasting.
And when you start talking about the cellular health, and I know you talked about earlier autophagy, and from what I understand, and certainly correct me if I'm wrong,
Yeah.
autophagy is just those weaker cells that are in the process of dying off that
Yes,
fasting helps speed up and get them out. And
absolutely.
when you think of it from that perspective, that's pretty profound, considering all you're doing is just not eating for a few extra hours. Like,
Right.
that's not hard. You know,
I mean,
we're not
yeah, for
asking you to
people
run a
who,
marathon.
exactly. And for people who, are like, is that really there? Again, that, that fast of 12 to 15 hours is kind of where we say, well, what if we just started there looking at some of the research? And I'm not talking about days of fasting or more than, that 15 hours, just even that 15-hour fast, which again, if we practically think about that, that could just be scheduling our meals in such a way that we finish eating, we focus on bedtime, we focus on that routine, we wake up in the morning and we break that fast with our breakfast. So you're right in thinking that idea of recycling, of really treating ourselves as if they need a break, because they do, right? They need some time to focus on recovery. And so we just, again, the research for even just that baseline fasting, it can help people reset their blood sugar dysregulation. We can see that even helpful with binge eating, even in the nighttime hours. If we just say, hey, we're going to like focus on nourishing our body during the day. And that's one big point I probably should have made earlier, that when we're going to have this window of time where we're saying to the body, hey, the priority here is on resting and digesting, not consuming, that really shifts our responsibility to nourish the body earlier in the day. Because I don't know about you, but if you've tried resting and digesting or fasting in the nighttime and you've skipped meals during the day, you've had snacks instead of protein, it is much more difficult mentally and physically to engage in that fast. And so I love the perspective of saying, if I can nourish my body through those other, you know, depending on the hours, those other hours during the day, if my body is truly nourished, if I've gotten all the fats and carbs and proteins and nutrients that I need, then it won't actually feel like it's deprived when I'm focusing on that resting and digesting.
Yeah.
Gastrointestinal health is another area where we really see benefit from that, where your gut has the time to, again, rest and digest in order to help with motility, to help with irritable bowel syndrome. We see some of the research emerging that just that window of division of resting and digesting versus consuming gives your gut a break too.
Yeah, that's, I can think back to different times in my life where maybe if I was working or something and I didn't have access to really nutritional food or good food for a couple of days. I can think of one instance for sure where I was working and there was a hurricane and I was just eating like whatever was at the station, which was not
Yeah,
healthy. And I remember coming home and my stomach hurt. I was bloated. I was uncomfortable. And I thought the only thing that I can do to kind of like hit the hard reset button here is I just need, and you know what? Fasting really wasn't a thing back then.
right,
But
right,
I
right.
said, "I've gotta have 3 days of nothing in my stomach to heal what I just did to it."
Feel that, right.
Yeah, and so that was a big it was that's what I needed. It fixed everything within 3 days. I was back to normal, felt great, and that kinda stuff. But the other thing I think that we have to keep in mind with fasting is that there's so much information in the Bible about health and wellness, and fasting is all throughout the
Right,
Bible.
right.
Fasting and prayer all throughout, and so I think we have to keep that in mind too, and I think research is great. I think common sense is better, and
Right, right.
really thinking through things and knowing your body, and so I think we have to keep that in perspective as well.
Well, and gosh, if there's a way that I can find this resource, I'm just trying to rack my brain with who he interviewed. And there's a guy that I love, teaches on spiritual disciplines, John Mark Comer.
Okay.
And in one of his spiritual disciplines, they're doing a kind of a group, a 4-week study where they talk about fasting and prayer and solitude and wealth of information. And what I loved is in one of those interviews, he goes back and interviews a psychologist that specializes in the world of biblical worldview and disordered eating. And so what she did was had this beautiful conversation of how do we take in the idea of fasting from a biblical Christian worldview and make sure that we don't muddy it with maybe some aspects that could be considered controlling or restrictive. How do we make sure that we see the heart of God in that refrain for both our bodies and our spirits?
Mhm.
So I just so appreciated how she dealt with a really tense topic,
Mhm.
in the health and wellness world and in the Christian community. I want to make sure that we handle that with such grace to say, like, it can be both and. It doesn't have to be either or.
Yeah, I think it's important. The other thing I've interviewed people recently within the last year who were never able to really lose significant weight on more
Yeah.
traditional diets. And once doctors gave them these very, in my opinion, strict parameters of intermittent fasting. Here are the windows that you eat. You eat 2 meals during that window and one small snack. And they were able to lose considerable amounts of weight that they needed to because they found some value in having
Yeah.
stricter parameters
Sure. Sure.
during.
Kind of that metabolic uptick, if you will.
Yes, yes, but
Yeah.
also from a mental perspective going, "Okay, my doctor's put me on intermittent fasting. Here are the hours a day that I eat. Here's what I'm going to eat. Here's what I'm not going." So, in other words, having like a very definite mindset going into the day or the week nutritionally. Do you think there's value to that as well?
And so much value, and you just made me think of something I noticed clinically. My background both as a functional dietitian and as a counselor, I kind of wear both of those hats all day every day, so I can't separate one from the other. But I often think that when people have that parameter, as you mentioned, they have this parameter, so there's kind of a safety around them, if you will, like, this is something someone else has told me. I think it also empowers people to focus on what their nutrients are going to look like during those eating windows. So if
Mhm.
a doctor or a practitioner says, hey, for you, for your body type, I think the healthiest thing to do would be to consider 2 meals a day and one snack, then we know, if we're being proactive and really treating our bodies as if they deserve it, we know that those 2 meals and one snack, we need to pre-plan. We need to think about, how am I going to get full? How am I going to nourish my body? How can those be nutrient dense? So there's kind of the secondary, maybe unintentional effect that people end up prioritizing what goes into those meals, whereas maybe eating all throughout the day, you just think, I'll get to it eventually. I'll eventually add those vegetables in. I don't know, too many people that are snacking on kale at the end of the day. But I
Yes.
think there's kind of that secondary effect that maybe if all that I have are those 2 or 3 windows of eating, then maybe they deserve more of my attention to nourish my body for those foods with those foods.
And you also, I think, and I've noticed just in my personal life,
Mm.
when you're snacking all day, the calories add up in a way that you're not always cognizant of.
Right, right,
And so that can be very problematic for some people who are trying to lose a significant amount of weight or trying not to gain weight or that type situation as well.
right. Yeah, I think it's funny, and as a mom, of multiple kids, both of us, I think when we are raising children, what do we tell them? Like, it's not time for that. It's not a meal time, or you'll have your snack soon. So even as I'm walking through families and kind of training them and how to prevent the snacking with their kiddos, what do? We say, well, this is a meal time. This is your breakfast. This is your
Yeah.
snack. This is your meal. This is your snack. So, I'm laughing or maybe even smiling and giggling, thinking like, so often we as adults are going back to what would have wanted our kids to be doing so long ago. We
Mhm.
want you
That's
to rest and digest. We want you to schedule your meals and snacks. So we're not trying to restrict people's health as an adult. We're trying to go back to what innately most parents would say we think that's best for our child.
true. Mhm. No question.